People always say islands are peaceful, quiet, safe. But when you're trapped miles away from the mainland, sometimes there's nowhere left to run. I took the job because I was desperate. After getting laid off from a warehouse job in Portland, I spent almost 2 months sleeping on my cousin's couch while applying everywhere I could. One night, I found a listing online looking for temporary maintenance workers on a private island resort off the coast of Maine. 3 weeks of work, free cabin, good pay. I accepted without thinking much about it. The island was called Blackwater Island, and the only way there was by ferry. The boat ride took almost an hour through thick gray fog that made the ocean look endless. There were only about 15 people staying on the island when I arrived, mostly older tourists looking for quiet hiking trails and fishing spots. The place itself looked beautiful in a strange way. Tall pine trees covered most of the island, and narrow dirt paths twisted through the woods toward old cabins and rocky cliffs overlooking the ocean. The manager, a tired-looking man named Ellis, handed me a flashlight and key. "Power cuts happen sometimes," he said. "Don't wander too deep into the woods after dark." I laughed a little. He didn't. The first 2 days were normal. I fixed broken railings, cleaned generators, and helped unload supply crates from the dock. But the third night changed everything. Around midnight, I woke up because someone was knocking on my cabin window. Not the door, the window. 3 slow taps. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up immediately. My cabin only had 1 window, and it faced the forest behind the building. There weren't supposed to be guests anywhere near that side of the island. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed and aimed it toward the glass. Nothing. Just trees moving slightly in the wind. I almost convinced myself I imagined it, until the tapping came again. Closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. I slowly walked toward the window. The beam of my flashlight swept across the trees, branches, wet leaves. Then I saw someone standing between the pines. Tall, completely still. I couldn't make out a face, only a dark silhouette. The moment my flashlight hit them, they stepped behind a tree and disappeared. I locked the cabin door and barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Ellis what happened. Instead of acting surprised, he just stared at me quietly. Then he asked, "Did you go outside?" "No." "Good." That was it. No explanation. No concern. Just good. That night, the power went out across the island around 10 p.m. The entire place became pitch black except for the lighthouse on the far cliffs, rotating slowly through the fog. I was in the maintenance shed trying to restart one of the generators when I heard running footsteps outside. At first, I assumed it was another worker, but then I heard multiple sets of footsteps circling the building. Fast. Uneven. Like several people running barefoot through wet dirt. I froze. The footsteps stopped. Then came scratching against the outer wall. Slow, dragging scratches. I grabbed a wrench and backed away from the door. Something hit the wall hard enough to shake the shed. Then another impact. And another. I killed my flashlight instantly and stayed completely silent. For nearly 10 minutes, I listened to movement outside. Heavy breathing. Footsteps. Soft whispering I couldn't understand. Then suddenly, nothing. Complete silence. I waited another 20 minutes before stepping outside. The fog was so thick I could barely see 20 feet ahead. That's when I noticed muddy footprints surrounding the shed. Dozens of them. Bare feet. Human. but oddly shaped. The toes looked too long. That was the moment I decided I was leaving the island first thing in the morning. But the next morning, the ferry never came. The weather had gotten worse overnight. Huge waves crashed against the dock, while rain hammered the island non-stop. Ellis gathered everyone inside the main lodge. "No boats today," he said. One of the tourists complained immediately, but Ellis ignored him. Then he locked the front doors. Actually locked them. That made everybody uneasy. Around sunset, one of the older guests went missing, a retired fisherman named Carl. People searched for over an hour before someone found his flashlight near the northern trails leading into the woods. The flashlight was still on, but Carl was gone. That night, nobody slept. We all stayed inside the lodge while the storm pounded the island. At around 2 a.m., the lighthouse beams suddenly stopped moving. Complete darkness swallowed the cliffs outside. Ellis stood up immediately. His face went pale. "They're back," he whispered. Before anyone could ask what he meant, something slammed against the lodge doors. Hard. Everyone jumped. Another slam followed, then another. The windows rattled violently. People started panicking, and through the glass, I finally saw them clearly. At least 6 figures standing outside in the storm. Tall, thin, barefoot, watching us, not moving, just staring. One of them slowly lifted its hand and began tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. The same sound from my cabin. Then every single one of them started smiling. Wide. Unnaturally wide. And that's when the power died completely. The last thing I remember before the screaming started was hearing the front door crack open. When I was 23, I took a summer job helping restore an old lighthouse off the coast of Washington State. The island was called Gullrock Island, a tiny chunk of land surrounded by jagged cliffs and freezing ocean water. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years after automation replaced the original keepers, but a local historical society wanted to turn it into a tourist attraction. There were only 4 of us staying there. Me, a college student named Rachel, an older electrician named Tom, and the supervisor, a quiet guy named Warren who barely spoke unless he had to. The island had no permanent residents, no stores, no roads, just the lighthouse, 2 supply cabins, and miles of rocky terrain covered in dead grass and twisted trees bent sideways by constant wind. The first few days were peaceful, too peaceful. No cars, no city sounds. At night, the only thing you could hear was waves crashing below the cliffs and the foghorn echoing across the water. That was what made the voice so disturbing. It started on the 4th night. I woke up around 1 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. My cabin was freezing cold, and thick fog pressed against the windows outside. As I walked down the hallway, I heard someone talking near the lighthouse entrance. At first, I thought it was Warren on the radio, but then I realized something was wrong. The voice sounded far away, yet impossibly clear, almost like somebody standing directly beside me whispering into my ear. "Come outside." I stopped walking immediately. The voice was male, calm, soft. "Come outside." I looked towards the front door. Nothing there. The entire cabin was dark. I checked Rachel's room first. She was asleep. Tom was snoring loudly in the next room. I convinced myself I was half dreaming and went back to bed. But the next morning during breakfast, Rachel looked exhausted. Before I could say anything, she asked, "Did either of you hear someone talking last night?" Nobody answered. Warren slowly looked up from his coffee. What did it say? Rachel hesitated. It kept asking me to come outside. The room became completely silent. Tom laughed nervously. Probably just whined around the tower. But Warren didn't laugh. Later that afternoon, I asked him privately if people had stayed on the island before us. He nodded once. Not for long. That answer alone made me uncomfortable. Things got worse after that. Every night, one of us heard the voice, sometimes near the lighthouse stairs, sometimes outside the windows, sometimes directly outside the cabins. Always the same tone. Calm. Patient. "Come outside." Tom finally snapped on the 6th night. Around midnight, we heard him yelling from outside the cabin. By the time we rushed out with flashlights, he was standing near the cliff trails in nothing but sweatpants and boots. His face looked terrified. "I heard my wife," he kept repeating. Tom's wife had apparently died 2 years earlier. "She sounded exactly the same," he whispered. "She said she needed help." After that, nobody wanted to be alone. We started staying together in the main cabin after sunset. Warren finally admitted something he should have told us earlier. Years ago, before automation, 2 lighthouse keepers disappeared during a winter storm. Only one body was ever found. According to local fishermen, people on the island had reported hearing voices for decades afterward, especially during heavy fog. Rachel wanted to leave immediately. So did I. But the supply boat wasn't scheduled for another 3 days, and a massive storm was already moving toward the coast. That night was the worst one. The fog became so thick, the lighthouse beam barely cut through it. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Around 11 p.m., the generator suddenly failed. The cabin lights died instantly. Everything went black. Tom managed to restart a few emergency lanterns, while Warren checked the fuel lines outside. That was when we heard screaming near the lighthouse. Warren's voice. We ran toward the tower with flashlights bouncing wildly through the fog. The sound echoed strangely across the cliffs, making it impossible to tell where he actually was. Then the screaming stopped. Completely. We found Warren standing near the edge of the cliffs, facing the ocean. Motionless. His flashlight lay on the ground beside him. Rachel called his name. No response. Tom grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. I still remembered the expression on Warren's face. He looked empty, like he'd seen something that completely broke him. Then he whispered, "There's people down there." We looked over the cliffs. At first I saw nothing except crashing waves far below. Then lightning flashed across the sky, and for 1 second, I saw figures standing on the rocks near the water. At least 10 of them, perfectly still, watching us. The next lightning strike came only seconds later. They were gone. Tom wanted to leave the island immediately despite the storm. Warren refused. He kept staring toward the cliffs like he was listening to something. That night, nobody slept. Around 3 a.m., the voice came back, but this time, it wasn't outside. It came from inside the lighthouse itself. "Come upstairs." The spiral staircase leading into the tower disappeared into darkness above us. Then we heard footsteps descending slowly from the top floor, 1 step at a time. Heavy. Wet. None of us moved. The footsteps kept getting closer. 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 Until finally we saw a figure emerging from the darkness above. Tall, dripping wet seawater onto the stairs. Its face hidden in shadow. And then Rachel suddenly whispered the worst thing I could possibly imagine hearing. "That's not Warren." Because the real Warren was still standing beside us, staring upward in horror. My friends and I found the island completely by accident. It wasn't on tourist maps. No signs pointed toward it. Honestly, we probably should have turned around the moment we realized nobody else was there. There were 5 of us total. Me, Dylan, Eric, Mason, and Kayla. We'd rented a small fishing boat during a summer trip in Florida and spent most of the afternoon exploring tiny islands scattered along the coast. The original plan was simple: drink beer, swim, maybe camp somewhere overnight before heading back in the morning. Nothing serious. Nothing dangerous. Near sunset, Mason spotted a narrow stretch of land far away from the others. The island looked strange immediately. No docks, no houses, no boats nearby. Just dense, jungle-like trees and black rocks surrounding the shoreline. Kayla didn't want to go near it. "Doesn't that place look wrong to you?" she asked quietly. We laughed at her. Huge mistake. As we got closer, the island somehow looked even less natural. The trees were too dense near the center, almost forming a wall of darkness. The shoreline was covered in slippery black stone instead of normal sand, and the water near the island looked darker than the surrounding ocean. Even the temperature felt colder, but Mason was obsessed with exploring it. "That's exactly why we should check it out," he said. We anchored near the beach around 6 p.m. The island itself felt unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Even the air smelled strange, damp, rotten somehow. Eric joked that it felt like we'd stepped into a horror movie. Nobody laughed very hard. About 20 minutes after we arrived, Dylan discovered something deep in the trees, a concrete structure partially buried underground. It looked old, military maybe. Half the roof had collapsed inward, covered by vines and moss. There was a rusted metal hatch sitting open near the entrance, and cold air was rising out of it. I remember feeling genuine fear for the first time right then. Not anxiety. Not nervousness. Real fear. Something about that hatch made every instinct in my body tell me to leave. But Mason grabbed a flashlight and climbed down anyway. Of course we followed him. The tunnel beneath the island stretched much farther than any of us expected. Concrete walls, rusted pipes, flooded sections filled with dark water. It looked like some kind of abandoned bunker. The deeper we went, the colder it became. Our flashlight beams barely reached the end of each corridor. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, echoing through the tunnels in ways that made distances impossible to judge. Then we started hearing noises. Soft, metallic banging somewhere far ahead. Clang, clang, clang. At first we assumed water was moving old pipes around, until the sound started changing positions, like something was moving down there, following us. Kayla wanted to leave immediately. Dylan agreed, but Mason kept pushing deeper underground, acting excited instead of scared. That's when we found the door. Huge steel door built into the concrete wall. Unlike everything else in the bunker, this door looked newer. Much newer. There were warning labels on it, but most had faded beyond readability, except for one line near the handle. Sealed below, "Do not open." Eric immediately started recording with his phone. Mason actually laughed. "Dude, this is definitely some Cold War bunker." Then he pulled on the handle. The door opened, and the smell that came out nearly made me throw up. Rotting meat, salt water, something chemical underneath it. The room beyond the door was massive, circular, almost like a giant underground reservoir. Dark water covered most of the floor, and in the center of the room stood dozens of metal support pillars disappearing into blackness above. That's where we heard the breathing. Loud, slow, somewhere inside the dark. We all froze. Kayla whispered, "Tell me you guys hear that." Another metallic clang echoed through the chamber, closer this time. Then came movement in the water, something large shifting beneath the surface. Mason finally looked nervous. Eric aimed his flashlight toward the water, and something moved between the pillars. Fast. Way too fast. The flashlight only caught part of it. Pale skin. Long limbs. Something dragging itself through the water using both arms. We turned and ran immediately. Nobody argued. Nobody tried investigating further. We sprinted through the tunnels as loud, splashing noises exploded behind us. Whatever was down there was chasing us. I heard water slamming against concrete walls, metal pipes shaking violently. Then Dylan screamed behind me. I turned just long enough to see him disappear into darkness after something grabbed his leg from ankle-deep water. Not pulled under, dragged sideways, fast. His flashlight spun across the tunnel floor before vanishing into blackness. We kept running. I hate admitting that. But we did. Pure survival instinct took over. By the time we reached the surface hatch, Mason was hyperventilating uncontrollably. We jumped back into the boat and started the engine immediately, but the engine wouldn't start. Eric kept trying while all of us stared toward the tree line. That's when we saw movement. Figures standing between the trees, human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall. Their arms hung too low beside their bodies, and even from the beach, I could hear water dripping off them. The engine finally roared to life. We sped away from the island as fast as possible. Nobody spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Then Kayla suddenly asked, "Where's Mason?" Silence. We turned around. Mason had been sitting near the front of the boat the entire time, but now his seat was empty. None of us saw him move. None of us heard him fall overboard. Nothing. Eric insisted Mason must have panicked and jumped into the water. But deep down, none of us believed that. As the boat sped farther from the island, I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see nothing except darkness and open water. Instead, I saw lights. Small lights moving between the trees on shore, not flashlights. These were dim and pale, almost greenish, swaying slowly through the forest like people carrying lanterns deep in the woods. Kayla saw them too. "What the hell are those?" Nobody answered. Eric kept driving while Dylan's blood still stained the back of the boat where he'd been dragged moments earlier. Then the radio suddenly turned on by itself. Static exploded through the speakers so loudly it made all of us jump. Eric tried shutting it off, but the knobs wouldn't respond. Through the static, something started coming through the speakers. At first, it sounded like random noise. Then I realized it was trying to mimic human speech. Broken words, distorted sentences, like something learning language in real time. "Help!" Static. "Wait." Static again. Then finally, "Don't. Leave." Kayla burst into tears immediately. Eric ripped the radio wires out with his hands, finally killing the sound. But even after the radio died, I swear I could still hear faint voices over the ocean behind us. Not one voice. Several. Calling from the island. When we reached the marina, police questioned us separately for hours. None of them believed the full story, obviously. They assumed Dylan and Mason drowned after panicking in unstable tunnels. But there was one detail I never told the police, because I knew how insane it sounded. While we were giving statements at the marina office, I noticed seawater dripping across the floor near the entrance. At first, I thought it came from our clothes. Then I realized the trail of water led inside from outside the building, like somebody soaking wet had walked in. The trail stopped directly behind the chair where Kayla was sitting, and beside the puddle were footprints. Long, narrow, almost human, but not completely. I looked up slowly towards the dark office window behind her. For 1 second, I thought I saw a face staring in from outside. Pale, smooth, with eyes reflecting light like an animal's. Then it disappeared. A week later, Kayla stopped answering messages. 2 weeks after that, Eric deleted every photo and video from the trip and vanished completely offline. I haven't spoken to either of them since, but sometimes late at night, I still listen to the audio file Eric sent me. Not because I want to, because part of me keeps hoping I imagined the last sound hidden in the recording. Right after Mason says, "It learned how to sound human," there's another voice in the background, very quiet, very deep, and it says, "We learned because of you." If you ever find an island that doesn't appear on any map, don't be the first person to explore it alone. Good night.